Murder by Invitation, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with an invitation, elegant, polite, and impossible to refuse. Guests arrive expecting nothing more than an evening of pleasant conversation and careful manners. Yet beneath the smiles and candlelight, something feels terribly wrong. The invitation was not sent to bring people together, but to place them exactly where someone wanted them. When a shocking death interrupts the gathering, the guests insist it was chance, a dreadful accident no one could have foreseen. Miss Marple, however, studies the guest list, the seating, and the timing, and realizes the invitation itself was the first step in a carefully planned crime. Because in St. Mary Mead, sometimes the deadliest trap arrives sealed in an envelope. Before we uncover who sent the invitation, and why, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: Murder by Invitation. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the post and laid among the circulars and bills like something that did not belong. It was printed on thick cream paper, the lettering dark and steady, neither elegant nor careless, but chosen with intent. Miss Marple noticed it at once. She always noticed such things. There was a weight to it, not only in the paper itself, but in the way it seemed to rest upon the table, as though it had every right to be there and would not be ignored. She adjusted her spectacles and read it slowly, every word receiving its due attention. The message was brief. A dinner invitation, nothing more on the surface. No flowery phrases, no polite excuses for troubling her. Simply a request, almost an assumption, that she would attend an evening gathering at Ravenscroft House on the following Saturday. The host was one Mr. Harold Whitcomb, a name she knew only faintly, attached to a distant recollection of church committees and quiet charitable donations. The tone of the invitation was courteous, yet firm, as though her presence were expected rather than hoped for. Miss Marple placed the card back upon the table and considered it. Invitations, she knew, were curious things. They could be generous, thoughtless, or carefully calculated. This one, she felt, belonged to the third category. It had been written by someone who understood that an invitation could be a tool, a means of arranging people as one might arrange objects upon a shelf, each placed precisely where it would serve a purpose. Outside, St. Mary Mead continued with its ordinary business. A dog barked in the distance, a bicycle rattled along the lane, and the sound of a radio drifted faintly from a neighboring house. All of it was comfortingly familiar. Yet the invitation sat between Miss Marple's teacup and her knitting, quietly insisting upon its importance. She sipped her tea and reflected that trouble rarely announced itself with noise or urgency. More often, it arrived politely, asking whether one would care to attend dinner. By Thursday, the village was already talking. News travelled quickly in St. Mary Mead, especially when it involved Ravenscroft House. The place stood a little apart, surrounded by old trees and a high hedge that suggested privacy rather than secrecy. Mr. Whitcomb had inherited it some years before and had since made a habit of inviting selected members of the surrounding villages to small gatherings. Such evenings were spoken of with approval, though always with a hint of curiosity. People liked to be invited, but they liked even more to discuss who else had been included. Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Bantry at the post office, who mentioned the dinner in an offhand way that was anything but offhand. Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with interest as she listed the rumoured guests, each name delivered with careful emphasis. A retired colonel known for his temper, a widow with a sharp tongue and sharper memory, a local businessman whose success had not softened his manners. The list was varied, yet Miss Marple sensed a common thread. These were people with histories, people who carried old grievances as neatly as they carried their handbags or walking sticks. That evening, Miss Marple examined her wardrobe with more attention than usual. She selected a dress of modest cut and neutral color, the sort that allowed one to blend into a room without disappearing altogether. Experience had taught her that it was easier to observe when others underestimated you. She pinned a brooch at her collar, its clasp secure, and laid out her gloves with care. Everything was prepared with the same quiet thoroughness that marked all her habits. Saturday arrived beneath a sky that promised rain but had not yet delivered it. Ravenscroft House looked imposing as Miss Marple approached, its windows glowing warmly against the encroaching dusk. Inside, the hall was already alive with low conversation and the faint clink of glasses. A maid took Miss Marple's coat and directed her toward the drawing-room, where Mr. Whitcomb stood greeting his guests with a practiced smile. He was a man of middle height, neatly dressed, with hair that had begun to thin but was carefully arranged to disguise the fact. His manner was courteous, even charming, yet Miss Marple noticed that his eyes never rested for long on any one person. They moved constantly, assessing, measuring, as though he were keeping track of invisible balances. When he greeted Miss Marple, there was a flicker of something like relief, quickly concealed. Dinner was announced soon afterward, and the guests took their places around a long table set with polished silver and spotless linen. Conversation began easily enough, guided by Mr. Whitcomb's light remarks and occasional questions. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple sensed tension, a tightening of the atmosphere whenever certain topics were touched upon. Names were mentioned, then hurriedly dismissed. A casual comment would be met with silence, or with laughter that sounded a shade too loud. Miss Marple listened more than she spoke. She observed the way the Colonel's jaw tightened when the businessman mentioned a property deal from years before. She noted the widow's smile, pleasant but cold, whenever Mr. Whitcomb addressed her directly. These small details were like stitches in a piece of embroidery, each insignificant on its own, but together forming a pattern. As the main course was cleared away, the conversation turned, quite naturally, to the past. Mr. Whitcomb spoke of old times, of changes in the village, of people who had moved on or passed away. It was all very gentle, very civilized. Yet Miss Marple felt a prickle of unease. The past, she knew, was rarely as settled as people liked to believe. It lingered, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. Dessert was served, a delicate pudding accompanied by coffee. The guests relaxed a little, chairs scraping softly as people shifted their positions. Then it happened. Mr. Whitcomb raised his cup, took a sip, and paused. For a moment, no one noticed. It was Miss Marple who saw the slight tremor in his hand, the way his eyes widened in surprise rather than pain. He set the cup down carefully, as though unwilling to disturb it, and tried to speak. The sound that emerged was not a word, but a faint, choking gasp. Chairs moved abruptly as those nearest him stood up. Someone called his name. Mr. Whitcomb collapsed forward, his body striking the table with a dull, final sound that silenced the room. The maid screamed, and the Colonel swore under his breath. The widow pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes bright with something that was not entirely shock. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded in her lap. She had seen death before, in many forms, and she knew its signs. This was no sudden illness, no unfortunate accident. This was deliberate. The invitation, the careful selection of guests, the precise timing of events, all of it had led to this moment. Murder, she reflected, was rarely spontaneous. It required planning, and often, an audience. The room descended into confusion. Someone ran for the telephone, another for water that would do no good. Miss Marple rose slowly and moved closer, her expression calm. She looked at the cup, still standing upright, its contents barely disturbed. A detail, perhaps, but one that would matter later. Around her, voices overlapped in a chorus of disbelief and accusation. As the first shock began to fade, Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of resolve. An invitation had been issued, and it had achieved its purpose. Now it was for her, quietly and patiently, to understand why. Chapter 2: The Invitation That Chose Its Guests. The arrival of the doctor and the local constable did little to restore order. Ravenscroft House remained steeped in a peculiar stillness, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the shock and were holding their breath. Mr. Whitcomb's body had been carefully carried from the dining room, leaving behind an emptiness more disturbing than his presence had been. The table remained set, the abandoned cup still where it had stood, a silent witness to the moment everything had changed. Miss Marple observed the scene with quiet attention. Panic revealed much about people, she had always believed, though not in the way they imagined. Some became loud, others withdrawn. A few attempted to take control, as though authority might protect them from suspicion. Each reaction was a clue, if one knew how to read it. The constable, a young man with an earnest expression, attempted to calm the guests, asking them to remain where they were. His voice shook slightly, but he did his best. The doctor confirmed what Miss Marple already knew. Mr. Whitcomb was dead, and it had happened swiftly. There were murmurs at the word poison, followed by an uncomfortable silence as the implication settled over the room. No one was allowed to leave. The invitation, so carefully issued, had now become a form of confinement. Miss Marple returned to her chair and folded her gloves neatly, as though the evening were proceeding exactly as planned. Inside, her mind was already working, arranging impressions and observations into tentative order. The guests were asked to gather in the drawing room while the dining room was examined. Lamps were lit, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist along the walls. The widow sat stiffly on a sofa, her hands clasped tightly together. The colonel paced, stopping now and then to glare at the others. The businessman spoke rapidly, insisting upon his innocence before anyone had accused him of anything at all. Miss Marple took a seat near the window. She had noticed earlier that the curtains there had been recently cleaned, their folds crisp and precise. Such details mattered. People who took care with small things often took care with larger ones too, including their secrets. Conversation resumed in fragments, each person eager to explain their presence, their movements, their lack of motive. Miss Marple listened, her expression mild. She thought again of the guest list, so carefully assembled. Mr. Whitcomb had not invited friends for companionship. He had invited them for reasons, each one selected with deliberation. The colonel spoke of a disagreement years before, dismissing it as trivial. The widow admitted, with a thin smile, that she and Mr. Whitcomb had not always seen eye to eye, though she insisted it was nothing more than a difference of opinion. The businessman complained that he had been unfairly treated in the past, but insisted that he bore no grudge worth killing for. Each statement was offered as a shield, yet each revealed more than intended. Miss Marple recalled something Mr. Whitcomb had said over dinner, a passing remark about debts, spoken lightly but received with noticeable discomfort by certain guests. Debts were not always financial, she reflected. Sometimes they were personal, moral, or emotional, and those were often the hardest to repay. When the police inspector arrived, the atmosphere shifted once again. He was older, more confident, and clearly accustomed to such scenes. He asked his questions calmly, taking notes, observing reactions. Miss Marple watched him in turn, noting that he paid her little attention. That suited her perfectly. The inspector focused first on the practicalities. The poison, whatever it was, must have been administered shortly before Mr. Whitcomb collapsed. Only those present at the table could have done it. The cup, the dessert, the coffee pot, all were examined. Miss Marple noticed the inspector frown slightly as he considered the arrangement of the place settings. Mr. Whitcomb's cup had been placed nearest the coffee pot, making it easy for him to serve himself. Miss Marple allowed herself a small inward smile. Convenience was often the murderer's ally. As questioning continued, Miss Marple reflected on the invitation itself. She had kept it in her handbag, and now she removed it discreetly, smoothing the paper between her fingers. The wording was precise, almost impersonal. There was no warmth in it, no suggestion of friendship. It was as though Mr. Whitcomb had been summoning his guests rather than welcoming them. An idea began to form, tentative but persistent. What if the invitation had not been issued to celebrate or entertain, but to confront? What if Mr. Whitcomb had intended to reveal something that evening, something that concerned each of them in turn? A confession, perhaps, or an accusation. Such intentions, she knew, could provoke desperate actions. She recalled the tension at the table, the way conversation had circled around the past without ever quite touching it. Mr. Whitcomb had been leading them there, gently but firmly, like a man guiding a reluctant horse toward water. Someone, she suspected, had realized where that path ended and had chosen to act first. The inspector announced that everyone would be questioned individually. One by one, the guests were called aside. Miss Marple waited patiently, her thoughts returning again and again to the cup. It had not been disturbed in the moment of collapse. Mr. Whitcomb had noticed something wrong before he drank enough to spill it. That suggested a fast-acting substance, and one that altered the taste or sensation immediately. When Miss Marple's turn came, she answered the inspector's questions with polite clarity. She described what she had seen, no more and no less. The tremor in Mr. Whitcomb's hand, the surprise in his eyes, the careful way he had set the cup down. The inspector listened closely now, his interest plainly awakened. Afterward, Miss Marple returned to her seat and observed the others anew. The widow dabbed at her eyes, though no tears fell. The businessman wiped his brow repeatedly, though the room was cool. The colonel had ceased pacing and now sat rigidly upright, his hands clenched upon his knees. Miss Marple thought of the way people behaved in moments of crisis, and how often those habits mirrored older patterns. The widow's composure reminded her of women she had known who concealed bitterness beneath perfect manners. The businessman's agitation suggested fear rather than guilt, but fear could arise from many sources. The colonel's rigidity spoke of discipline, but also of suppressed emotion. As the evening wore on, fragments of information emerged. Old disputes resurfaced, half-forgotten incidents dragged into the light. Mr. Whitcomb, it seemed, had been involved in a legal matter years earlier, one that had affected each of them differently. Documents had been signed, decisions made, lives altered. Resentment had lingered, quietly nourished over time. Miss Marple listened and remembered similar stories from St. Mary Mead. A boundary dispute that ended in tragedy. A will that divided a family beyond repair. People, she knew, did not forget such things, no matter how civilized they appeared. They simply learned to live alongside their anger, waiting for the right moment to let it speak. By the time the police concluded their initial inquiries, the sense of shock had been replaced by something colder and more unsettling. Suspicion had settled among the guests like a fine dust, clinging to every glance and gesture. No one trusted anyone else. The invitation had achieved its final purpose. It had gathered together not friends, but suspects. As the guests were escorted to their rooms for the night, Miss Marple paused in the doorway of the drawing-room and looked back. Ravenscroft House, with its polished surfaces and orderly arrangements, no longer seemed merely grand. It seemed staged, like a setting prepared for a single, dreadful act. Miss Marple climbed the stairs slowly, her mind already tracing connections, weighing motives, recalling expressions. Somewhere within those carefully chosen guests was the answer. Unlike the invitation itself, the truth would not announce itself loudly. It would wait to be noticed by someone patient enough, and perceptive enough, to recognize it. Chapter 3: The invitation kept its promise. Morning light revealed Ravenscroft House without mercy. What had seemed imposing and orderly the night before now appeared exposed, every corridor too long, every doorway too narrow. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and sat by the window of her room, watching the garden below. Dew clung to the grass, catching the light in a way that suggested innocence, though she knew better. Gardens, like villages, often concealed more than they revealed. Downstairs, the household stirred with subdued efficiency. Breakfast was served quietly, the guests gathered around the table once more, though the arrangement was altered. Mr. Whitcomb's chair was gone. Its absence was louder than any presence could have been. Conversation was minimal, and when it occurred, it remained carefully impersonal. Each guest watched the others with open caution now, no longer attempting to disguise it. Miss Marple observed them all anew, her thoughts steady and precise. The widow avoided looking at the others directly, her gaze lingering instead on her teacup. The businessman ate little, his attention fixed on the door as though expecting interruption. The colonel maintained a stiff courtesy, his voice controlled, his eyes alert. Each of them, Miss Marple reflected, was behaving exactly as one might expect. Which meant, of course, that appearances alone would not be enough. The inspector arrived shortly after breakfast, bringing with him fresh determination and a sheaf of notes. He announced that certain details had been confirmed overnight. The poison, introduced into the coffee, was rare but effective. It had been dissolved quickly, leaving little residue and acting almost at once. Whoever had used it had known precisely what they were doing. Miss Marple felt no satisfaction at being correct. Experience had taught her that being right in such matters was never a pleasure. She listened as the inspector continued, outlining movements, timings, opportunities. Everyone present had access to the coffee pot at some point during the evening. Opportunity alone, therefore, proved nothing. What mattered, Miss Marple knew, was intention. She excused herself politely and asked to walk in the garden. The inspector agreed, assigning a constable to remain nearby. Miss Marple did not object. She had long since learned that truth often emerged most clearly when one was allowed to think without interruption. The garden paths were neatly kept, gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes. She paused near a bench, recalling a moment from the previous evening. Mr. Whitcomb had spoken of the past, yes, but not with regret. There had been something else in his tone, something anticipatory. As though he believed himself on the brink of resolution. The invitation, she realized, had been more than a gathering. It had been a reckoning. Miss Marple returned inside with renewed clarity. She asked the inspector if she might speak with the guests together. He hesitated, then agreed. There was, after all, little to lose. The drawing-room filled once more, the atmosphere tense but expectant. Miss Marple stood near the fireplace, her hands folded, her voice gentle but steady. She spoke of villages, of how people lived alongside one another for years, accumulating grievances as quietly as dust. She spoke of wrongs done and never properly addressed, of how time did not heal such things, but merely buried them deeper. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple continued, turning at last to Mr. Whitcomb's motives. He had summoned them, she said, not to entertain, but to confront. He had intended to reveal his role in a decision made long ago, one that had harmed each of them in different ways. He believed, perhaps naively, that confession might bring relief. That honesty might lead to forgiveness. She paused, allowing the idea to settle. Forgiveness, she knew, was not something that could be demanded. One of the guests spoke sharply, denying any such knowledge. Another followed, protesting innocence of motive. Miss Marple listened, then nodded gently. Of course they would deny it. People rarely admitted to intentions they barely acknowledged themselves. She turned her attention to the widow, whose composure had been flawless from the start. Miss Marple spoke of appearances, of how politeness could become a shield behind which resentment festered. She spoke of letters, carefully preserved, of memories replayed again and again until they grew sharper rather than duller. The widow's expression changed, only slightly, but enough. Miss Marple pressed on, describing a woman who had lost something precious through another's deliberate action, and who had waited years for acknowledgement that never came. The room seemed to shrink, drawing all attention toward the figure on the sofa. At last, the widow spoke. Her voice was calm, but there was a hardness beneath it. She admitted to knowing what Mr. Whitcomb had planned to say. She had guessed, she said, from the guest list alone. She had realized that he meant to confess publicly, to clear his conscience at last. And she had known that such a confession would change nothing. It would not restore what she had lost. It would only reopen old wounds. Miss Marple nodded, neither condemning nor excusing. She asked, quietly, about the coffee. About the moment when everyone's attention had been elsewhere. About the knowledge required to administer the poison so swiftly and cleanly. Silence followed, thick and heavy. Then the widow sighed, the sound of someone laying down a burden at last. She admitted it without drama. She had done it deliberately, carefully. Not in anger, she said, but in certainty. Mr. Whitcomb had chosen his audience. She had chosen her moment. The inspector stepped forward, signaling to the constable. There was no resistance. The widow rose, smoothing her skirt, her face strangely peaceful. As she was led away, Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a familiar sadness. Murder, she reflected, was never the end of a story. It was merely the point at which all other endings were denied. Later, as Ravenscroft House returned to its uneasy quiet, the inspector thanked Miss Marple with genuine respect. She accepted it with modest grace, already turning her thoughts homeward. St. Mary Mead awaited, with its hedges and habits, its comforts and concealed tensions. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple glanced once more at the place where the invitation had begun its work. It had promised an evening, nothing more. And yet it had delivered something far greater, and far more terrible. Invitations, she knew now more than ever, could be dangerous things. If you have followed this mystery to its end, and if you enjoy quiet observations, hidden motives, and the slow uncovering of truth, then stay with us. Like, subscribe, and return for more tales where ordinary places conceal extraordinary secrets. There are always more invitations waiting to be opened, and more mysteries for those patient enough to notice them.